The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. Hello and welcome to History Jackson, the home of accessible and digestible history. And welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series, where we'll be talking to some of the historians, living historians and performers here at Chalke about what they're doing at the festival and their work. Now, Chalke History Festival will be covered comprehensively through History Jackson, be it on our social media, our blog, and our podcast. So if you wanted to check out more and learn more about what's happening at Chalke, do head to the links in the description below. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you to our Chalke History Festival special series episode. So hello and welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series here on History Jackson, and we are joined by the amazing Peter Caddick-Adams. How are you doing?
Yeah, oh great. All the better for seeing you, actually, on this
thank you very much.
As advertised, English summer's day.
Oh, it is a perfect day. Although I feel that you're going to be very hot by the end of the day in your...
I'm acclimatised. I live half the year in Croatia, so when I came over here, I consulted with the weather gods, and I said, little less than Croatia, a bit more than the usual English summer. Go light on the rain, please, and a bit of a breeze, and that's what we've got.
Yeah, I think you've struck a very very good deal there. So, I think the first question I'm going to ask you, and it's a bit of a cliche, really, from a podcast, but what inspired you to get into history?
That's very easy. Actually, two things, but they both sort of coincided. When I was 10, and that's an awfully long time ago now, my mother took me to see the film The Battle of Britain. The film with the rogue doorbell that appears halfway through. Ever since my art master at school sort of said, Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts would appear on the page whether or not they were required, and it obviously sort of lit a fuse. But she had been 10 when the Battle of Britain was fought, and she wanted me to know how it was for her, which I thought was a very sort of clever move. But she was a very godly pacifist lady, so she was absolutely horrified at this sort of interest that she ignited. But also on my 10th birthday, I was given a plastic Airfix model kit.
Oh, awesome.
So I come from what I call the Airfix School of Military History. And I had to buy every kit there was, principally aircraft, hang them from the ceiling of my bedroom, obviously, paint them up. If I bought them on a Friday, glued them together, painted them, I could throw them out of the window with a burning match in them by Sunday. And so I was Airfix Supremo for a few years, and cut out all the artwork and framed it and put it on my wall. So that's very good, because it teaches you what all the fiddly little bits do.
Yeah.
And you get, my Second World War vehicle and aircraft recognition skills are second to none. I mean, I defy any vehicle recognition people to beat me, because I was already master of that age 10.
Oh, that's an amazing story. I love the personal touch to it as well, and you can't beat a good Airfix model. So,
still, I mean, they're going through a revival, because my age group, my demographic are they're the ones now with money and time to revisit Airfix. So Airfix is went bust a couple of times, and I wrote when they went bust in the 1990s. I wrote an article for the BBC about what Airfix meant to me, and that was the most downloaded article on the BBC website for that year, and around the world. And I just hadn't realised the connectivity. So there were people from Argentina and from Brazil and from Japan and from Hungary and from Russia, all sort of writing in and saying, because this was sort of Glasnost days, that was my life too. And you suddenly realise, actually, there's millions of people around the world who suddenly, were coming of age just when plastic model kits were at their apogee.
That's brilliant. The fact that you're able to connect with such a wide audience on it is just amazing.
That's what this history festival does. And I was, the number of folk who come over from the United States and from Canada, even from Australia, I've met here, coming here, is just astonishing. And that's what Chalke Valley History Festival has done since year one, which I think was 15 years ago now.
Oh, that's a very good go. And you were at the first one.
James Hahn very kindly invited me to speak at the first one and interview Lord Ashcroft about his VC collection. And that seemed to go particularly well. So I've been allowed back because I made no errors. And apart from COVID, I've been here every year, and it's grown iteratively each year. It's lovely to be on the ground floor of something that's sort of grown as much as this has.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic festival. I love coming. You get to connect with so many historians like yourself and learn so much more. But you're also doing some talks and moderating some talks where people can come and learn more about these events. And one of them I think is incredibly poignant at the moment is D-Day. You're looking at D-Day and what's happened on that day. Why is it, I know we've just had this narrative, but why is it important for us to remember D-Day and remember what happened in that event, particularly this year?
Well, I'll give you another personal anecdote about D-Day. So there used to be a magazine called After the Battle, which used to match then and now photographs of the Second World War with the same location today. And in 1975, they accompanied a guy who restored military vehicles and took them to Normandy. And I read about this and badgered my parents. So instead of going on a family holiday, I sort of joined this group in that year, 1975. And we went to the D-Day beaches. So I went to Normandy with a group of about 100 vehicles, some of which were driven by Second World War veterans. I mean, I cruised around Normandy in 1975 on a half track, driven by a guy who had driven ashore on D-Day itself.
That's amazing.
And we got off the ferry, we drove to Sword Beach, and there was Bill Millin with his bagpipes, who was part of our tour as well. So I've connected with those beaches and those veterans, for however many years, 50, 60 years. And it's a big part of my personal DNA. And then we went to Utah Beach, and some guy brought out a metal detector when they were very new and fangled and unfashionable, and he went poking around the sand dunes and produced a rifle cartridge which can only have been fired on D-Day. And then we found an unopened tin of US Army peanut butter, which was slightly less desirable to find. But again, it was the magic of provenance. This is Normandy, this is D-Day, 6th June 1944, all the rest of it. So, that magic has never left me. So I'd always felt I had a sort of D-Day book in me, and I've had sort of various iterations of careers. So I've been a soldier for a lot of my life, reserve and regular. But I was a journalist once, and I was a journalist in Washington, D.C., for the Washington Times in 1984. And we flew over to Normandy for the 40th anniversary of D-Day with President Reagan. And that was the time he made a very famous speech likening the struggle against Nazi Germany to the struggle against the tyranny of the Soviet Union. So Normandy, at big times of anniversaries, has also been part of my sort of DNA makeup, and I've always been there for the big anniversaries. And I've watched that change. So for the 50th in 1995, 1994, the Queen was there. We had all the D-Day veterans, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nail paraded on the sand at Omaha Beach, at Arromanches by the artificial harbour. And this, so 1994, we were able to say thank you to them all. And then slowly, as they've been fading, it switched to sort of commemoration. So it started off as politics. And it was very much an Anglo-American sort of thing. De Gaulle wouldn't go because the French play such a minor role in D-Day. Their big invasion is the south of France, where they're in the majority. So de Gaulle actually wouldn't go because he didn't like the Americans. That was 1964. So heavy overlay of politics. By 2004, Putin is included. Angela Merkel of Germany is invited along. So we then shift to forgiveness, and then Putin is invited to the next one because there were Russian observers and soldiers on both sides in small numbers banned from this year's, and then this year is really the last D-Day veterans, and less than 100 all told, turn up in Normandy, and they won't be around for any more. You can't expect a 100-year-old ex-soldier, veteran, to turn up in Normandy for an anniversary anymore. So what they were doing was setting up for future commemorations, and the number of young people there this year, it's all about handing on the torch to another generation. So people like me are sort of acting as the bridge, and the veterans were there to say, this is where I was, this is what I did, to the very youngest people who are sort of 10 and 15, because D-Day now is shorthand for the Second World War.
Yeah.
If you do D-Day at school, or you do a battlefield tour from your school, like the Somme is, or something similar from the First World War, you want one iconic event that's very dramatic, that's very visible, where there are a lot of remains still to be seen, and it's easy to get to. And D-Day is that place. So this year is really important we get it right. So I think we have, and the British Memorial at Gold Beach set it up perfectly.
Yeah, I think it was incredibly poignant. The remembrance and the commemoration of the events that were put on. But I also like how it's played a role in every single one of your careers that you've had, and how you work so hard to make sure it's commemorated. But then it also ties in with another one of your tours, where you're talking about the retreat from strategy, how about the military and Britain, how we're possibly messing that up and we're possibly missing a step, and you're moderating that talk. How important is it for us to look at the military and make sure our military is properly funded and
hugely important. So I mean, I've lectured for 20 years at the UK Defence Academy, and over that period I've inserted into all my lectures my own personal views, which is that size of military is really important, because what we tend to argue is that technology is the panacea for all problems, and the future world is going to revolve around cyber warfare and media and information, and therefore that's where we put our money, and that we can therefore use fewer people, because that's the biggest budget of the MOD, is people and their pensions. So if we reduce that expenditure and we invest in all these other areas, we've got it cracked. But I mean, Ukraine's just completely blown that to smithereens, as I always said it would. So I was predicting the clash in Ukraine from 2012. So I'm not a least bit surprised at the way things have panned out. I mean, my Twitter following used to be about 5,000 or 10,000, and when Russia invaded on the 24th of February 2022, within the week it was 75,000. And that was people so worried there was going to be World War III. And interesting, 2.5 years later, they've all stayed with me. Because, so Russia is about, yes, it's about information, yes, it's about cyber warfare, but it's still old-fashioned, heavy metal war with lots and lots of tanks and guns and people and aircraft. And you can't get away from that. So what we've done is consciously reduce the numbers of old heavy metal pieces of kit and people, and that's not the solution, and it doesn't work. And if you aim to be a world player, which Britain does, it's not enough to have an aircraft carrier to send somewhere. Most Royal Navy ships need 2 crews, so you can change them if it goes away for more than about 6 months. And the Royal Navy just doesn't have enough people, doesn't have enough aircraft to man its aircraft carriers. We're going to have Challenger 3 that is going to be the new tank, but the purchase is going to be capped at 150 examples. Well, what's that going to do in the great scheme of things? We all assumed that war would be if there was a conventional war in Europe, it would go nuclear very quickly, and therefore that's what we had to concentrate on, which was all of the sort of nuclear deterrence and nuclear capabilities and uniforms and gas masks. And that hasn't risen its ugly head in Ukraine. So we have all the solutions, we have all the doctrine, but this boils down to political will. And we've seen a whole series of politicians ever since the Cold War ended who've wanted to deliver on the peace dividend, spend less on defence and more on other fields. We used to spend 10% of our budget on defence. It was even still 5% in the 1990s, and it's under 2.5% now. People are arguing about whether we should spend 2.5% on defence by 2030. I'm sorry, you need to wake up and spend 5% now, but it will take that amount of money just to play catch up.
Yeah. No, I see your point of making about catch up, because, as you said, Ukraine has changed how we see the future of warfare. How and where then do you see our conventional forces, and you've already mentioned about numbers, needing to be improved or bulked up in order to compete in this new world where we have Ukraine conflict happening there, possibly a proxy in a new Cold War?
Well, I'm very angry that we left Germany, because we never needed to leave Germany. That was a sort of Cameron initiative, and we had all the infrastructure there, and that was predicated on some kind of clash in Eastern Europe. Well, as soon as we leave Germany, there is a clash in Eastern Europe. So that was a very big mistake. And of course, what happens is once you divest yourself of the infrastructure, we gave it all back to the Germans, although we built it. So we invested over 50 years. You could amortise the costs. It cost us very little to run British forces in Germany. Handed it back to the Germans. They've now filled all of those bases with refugees, so we can't get them back. But the point about Germany was it offered lovely training areas. So if you are exercising mobile infantry battalions in armoured personnel carriers and tanks, you need huge areas over which to exercise. And Germany offered that because they've got acres and acres of nothing. And we don't have that in the United Kingdom. The exercise areas at Salisbury Plain, Catterick are tiny by comparison. So we're now having to exercise elsewhere, and that's one reason why we deploy to places like Estonia as a deterrence force, but also as an exercising area. That's one reason why we've made another mistake. So where are the areas of tension? Quite clearly, sort of Eastern Europe. I think Poland is emerging as a major power. It's a major economic power. It wasn't caught by the financial meltdown in 2008. They didn't really borrow very much. They are becoming. I mean, they'll eclipse Germany one day at this rate, and they're becoming a major military power because, of course, they're all now buying American, not Soviet or Russian equipment. So that's one area of tension. The Middle East always was and always is and always will be an area of tension, particularly now. Hezbollah and Hamas and an Israeli government that's quite tetchy and confrontational. But I won't say any more because you get wellied whichever side you take. But that's very worrying because the reaction of all the other Gulf states to what's going on in Israel and Gaza is beginning to fall out into different sides, and clearly the Iranians and the Saudis are the two rival regional powers there, and they've kept an uneasy peace, but that's beginning to sort of fray at the edges, and the last thing we need is anything sort of kicking off there. If it does, it'll be like the oil crisis of 1974, where there won't be any petrol for cars, and we'll be able to picnic on motorways, if you remember those famous photographs.
Yes.
So Taiwan and China doesn't want any kind of military confrontation. I think a lot of people have got that wrong. China is really worried about its resources, which are not in China but elsewhere. All the valuable minerals they need are outside China. And their navy is only a coastal force. It's not a deep water navy. They've got one aircraft carrier which they're still learning how to use. So they don't have any ability to project force, and the Chinese army can't go anywhere unless it's got a navy to transport it and protect it. So they are not the threat that a lot of people interpret that they are. What they can do and will do and want to do is economic threat. But that's a different kettle of fish. You know, if your opponent is opposing you economically, then that's the way you fight them back. So I'm less worried about Southeast Asia. I'm more worried about conflicts closer to home. And you know, radical Islam is still there. It's just not managed to rear its ugly head recently, thank goodness. But in fact, they've been wellying the Russians. The Russians have got their own problem with their own Islamic radicals. So the world is full of tension. But I think there's been a lot of misreporting. The Russians have been rattling the saber like mad. They've been rattling. They love the word nuclear because it does make a lot of people very scared. And they've been particularly using that word since 2022. But no evidence, not a slightest bit of evidence that they intend to go down that route. There's no exercises with their nuclear weapons. The soldiers don't deploy with nuclear suits or gas masks or anything else. Our satellites watch every single nuclear base and every single tactical nuclear missile, so we would know a long time before. So there's not the slightest sniff of a hint of a sliver of nuclear real nuclear threat or interest or attention.
I know those comments you're making there are going to put some people at ease.
Well, that was all my message in 2022. It's just not going to happen. Certainly not in the Russians' interest. If you attack Ukraine, for example, with tactical nuclear weapons, and the wind blows the wrong way, who's going to get it? The Russians.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense that you're going to attack your own people anyway. And a lot of this saber rattling is not for us. I mean, we have to remember that the Russian foreign ministry and the Kremlin spokesman, Mr. Peskov, and Putin himself and his old prime minister, Mr. Medvedev, their message whenever they go into anti-American, anti-NATO, or particularly anti-British rant is for their own people. So we pick it up and we listen to it and we respond to it and react to it. But this is all about selling the Russian power to the Russian people, because they are solely reliant on Russian media for their world picture. Putin completely controls the media of all different kinds. But when people start disappearing and coming back in coffins fighting in Ukraine, they start to feel uneasy. So all of this is about projecting Russian power. We can blow up the West any time we want. We've had all sorts of bollocks coming from the Kremlin about destroying Stonehenge, which I wasn't aware that was a major military target. But there you go. But it's one of the few places of which Russians have heard. So you can say, we'll blow up the Tower of London and Stonehenge. Well, that's really going to affect the price of fish. But that gives the game away that all of this Russian bizarre eccentricity of comment is actually aimed at the Russian people, not ourselves.
Yeah. And talk about political messaging and people communicating with their people. You've written a book recently, and it's come out this week whilst we've been at Chalke, on Churchill. Yeah. What inspired you to write that book?
I've always had a Winston Churchill book in me, and it's very difficult to pitch to any publisher. Do you know how many books there are about Winston Churchill?
I don't know the exact number, but I can say I would probably go with about 400.
Right, you're way out of beam. It's over 1,000.
Oh.
So he has had more biographies or studies or analyses written on or about him than all the other British Prime Ministers put together and then some. And so it's very difficult to find anything new. But you can't help but acknowledge that he's a major driving force, not just in the Second World War, but all the way through the first half of the 20th century. And because he's so much more than a politician, he's an aviator, he's a bricklayer, he's a racehorse owner, he's a very good painter. He writes over 15 million words and 30 books in his lifetime. He crafts some of the major histories of the 20th century, the First World War, Second World War. I mean, he whatever field he works in, he strides like a colossus. He wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. I mean, and there's all the iconic sort of props that he uses, cigars and hats and walking canes and everything else. I mean, he's a dandy. But what comes down to us is an incredibly energetic man, half American, lives long, so that's why he has a big footprint in history. But a publisher came to me and said, could you do a little book on Winston Churchill, because we want to do a series on British Prime Ministers. So this is the Swift Press, and my Winston Churchill is number one, the opener of their series of books on Prime Ministers. So it was a joy to do, but terrifically complicated, because what do you leave out of this man's life? I could have written another of my legendary doorstops of 1,000 pages, and I was told I was only allowed 200 pages and 50,000 words.
Oh, that might have been a little bit difficult.
Well, I've done it. What I did find was a press review of a talk he did in 1900. And in 1900, he's just been elected to the House of Commons on the back of having escaped from a prisoner of war camp in the South African, the Boer War. And he is one of the very first people recorded in history to have been captured in war and escape. And because he was already a prominent person, his father was the son of a duke and Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he was a sort of quite well-known figure, verging on public figure, even at the time. And he was working as a journalist as well as a soldier, quite a complicated sort of set of ideas that the MOD at the time hadn't really sorted out in their own mind. So he escapes, makes a home run in South Africa to safety. And because that takes 2 or 3 weeks, the world is on tenterhooks as to whether he's alive or dead. The Boers overreact and issue a famous poster wanting Winston Churchill dead or alive, £25 reward issued, which is about 5 years' salary. And Churchill then sort of pops up. So he has all of a sudden, he has a story to tell which is not someone else's, because he's been writing other people's histories up to then. So he becomes a sort of celebrity in his own right. And in London in October 1900, he does a talk about his escape. And the reviewer says, wow, this was absolutely fantastic in manner. He's a bit like his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. But we were held on the edge of our seats. And I think Winston Churchill is a man we will hear more from again. He must rise very high in the ladder of public life. I hope, and I'm pretty sure, that one day we will be proud to call Winston Churchill one of our own, one of our great Englishmen. Now, that was written in 1900, and it just shows you the weight of expectation on his shoulders. So there have been plenty of other people since who've had that expectation but haven't delivered, recent prime ministers included. But I mean, Churchill did. It took him till 1940 when he becomes prime minister. I mean, he had his career had May 1940 not happened, had he not become prime minister, people would have looked back and said, yeah, interesting guy, dominates politics in the first half of the 20th century, a lot of potential. Made some mistakes, interesting person, but let's move on. And that all changes in sort of May, June 1940, when he is a pensioner. I mean, he becomes, if you think of steering the country through Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the three big events of that year and of the whole home front experience. Winston Churchill is already a pensioner, when most of us would want to put our feet up and certainly wouldn't have the energy to steer a country through the worst time in its recorded history. And that's what he achieves, and I think that's why his legacy and his reputation completely changes. So yes, he does have quite a lot of flaws and faults, and his First World War and Second World War histories cover up some of his flaws. So I look at his reputation. I present, some of the mistakes he made, plus, the big one, the big sort of positives that we all know. And what I hope is I offer a balanced account of a more human individual, because it's easy to elevate him to the status of being a Superman. So it was actually really enjoyable book to write, and because I'd found this little press cutting that no one else had used, it's not in any of the other biographies, I started with that and I finished with that. So I actually thank goodness. Thank you, Winston. I mean, you can't write about him without realising the great man is up there looking down, nodding with approval. He also knew or felt that he was going to be, world famous. So right from an early age, he archived his whole life. So he wrote a 2-volume biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, and he wrote a 4-volume biography of the Duke of Marlborough, who was also an ancestor. And he knew how difficult it was to write biographies of people, because they only become famous later in life or after they've died. So when you're looking for sources, it's like collecting random archaeological potsherds. So he thought he'd preempt that. So the Churchill Archives in Cambridge have every tailor's bill, every cigar, dealer's bill, all the household bills, all his correspondence with newspaper editors, grumblings with agents about not being paid enough, his dealings with the Paul Roger Champagne House. I mean, he did like his champagne. Now, I wish I had his capacity for champagne, because he had a bottle of champagne every lunchtime, poured out in a silver tankard. The silver tankard lived in a special leather case, went with him absolutely everywhere, and he drank a pint of champagne every single lunchtime.
That is remarkable.
Paul Roger woke up to the fact that there was this amazing British customer who ordered more champagne than anyone else. So they reserved the whole of the 1928 vintage for him. And when he drunk that dry, they reserved 1933 for him. And when he drunk that dry, there was another vintage they put aside. So towards the end of his life, they did a tally and worked out that he hadn't necessarily drunk because he was a great entertainer, but he had ordered 42,000 bottles of champagne from them, which the smaller champagne houses don't even produce that.
No, that's an impressive volume.
So, but he's a big man. I mean, he's a portly man, so he can imbibe all of this. But I wish I had a bit of Churchill DNA in me for all sorts of reasons, but not least the fact that he seems to have this remarkable intolerance or tolerance for alcohol that carries on, not just for champagne at lunchtime, but fine wines at dinner and whiskey and brandy and port, well into the small hours.
Oh, it's incredibly impressive. Now, talking of incredibly impressive, we're at Chalke History Festival, and I've got a final fun question for you, Peter. You've obviously been coming to Chalke since the first one. What has been your favourite thing that you've seen, heard, learned, or witnessed across the years?
Oh, I mean, all sorts of things. So I can remember all sorts of speakers coming here. I can remember Jacob Rees-Mogg being interviewed and taken apart. Very entertaining. By a young thrusting historian who's doing very well and has produced a very good book called Tim Bouverie, but then he was a relative unknown. I can remember Boris Johnson wafting through here and going off to the cloakroom to artistically ruffle his hair before he came out for public view. But last year, I mean, there was the festival started with John Major, who came and sat on stage and gave a lovely talk, partly about being a Prime Minister, partly about cricket, which is one of his other loves. And he came across as a very well-rounded individual. and he started the festival incredibly well last year. And he finished his talk with an anecdote of meeting Mikhail Gorbachev, and he'd met him several times during Glasnost. And they were flying back to Moscow for something, and so they got on this plane together, and it was Gorbachev's plane. And Major turned to Mikhail, as he called him. Mikhail, how's it going in the Soviet Union? Because it was still the Soviet Union in those days. Just give me a quick one word. How's it going? Good. And John Major thought, no, that doesn't really tell me enough. Give me a bigger picture about the Soviet Union. Not good.
That's a brilliant anecdote to start and end a talk as well. So yeah, but people are going to want to go away and read some of your books and interact with you online after they've listened to this episode. How can they do that?
Well, I because I live sort of half the year in Croatia, I live a lot of my life online through social media because it's my way of connecting with people I can't see or meet. So I'm on Twitter as Military History with an I at the end instead of a Y, and that following is built up. And I do chat to an awful lot of people who suddenly pop up out of the woodwork here.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lawrence of Bessarabia. You'll know me as, but here I am looking completely different to how you would have expected, or whoever it is. So there's that, and I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook, but I like to feel I'm very accessible because I think that's really important for historians. So one of the joys here is not just signing books and selling them, but it's just chatting to people and getting feedback, because as a historian you everybody sort of claps you on the back and said, it was a great read, but very few people come up to you and say that was actually bollocks. Or you didn't expand on this, or you left that out. And the one place I find that people have the courage to say, great book, good investment, I didn't feel I'd wasted my money, but you left this out, or have you thought of writing that? And that's what you get from Chalke Valley. And it's not just me, it's every major historian in the English speaking world will come here at one stage or other, and especially when they've got a new book out, but not only when they've got a new book out. And that's the importance of sort of coming here, because it just, in 15 years, I would say the majority of new books that have made an impact in the English-speaking world their authors have had a presence here. And it's a great banner for female historians who are always had a sort of never really acknowledged as having a major impact on the writing of history, and have quite rightly found their sort of equal place alongside their male chums. So it's history for everybody. It's our history. There's such a superb lineup, and it's not just history, because it merges into current affairs. Where does history start? Last week's history, the history of the D-Day 80th, which we've just been talking about, that's now, we've just turned that into history. We've just been analysing, the latest turn of the wheel in the story of D-Day. So already that's history, and it's only a couple of weeks old. So that's what this is about. History doesn't sit in dusty books at the top of a library shelf to be consulted just by a few sort of geeky, nerdy people. It's our day-to-day life, and I hope that's what Chalke conveys. And then you've got all the hands-on reenactors. As a man, you and I are looking at a Saxon roundhouse that was built last week out of clay and soil and shit, and has got a straw roof. And that was built using the traditional methods that the Saxons would have used in the post-Roman period. And over there's a forge, and people are making stone hand axes and bronze, and there's a blacksmith there, and he's
You've even got a Cooper. That's it.
Well, absolutely. What can we smell? We can smell wood smoke. And in the back, I don't know whether the mic's picking that up, there's a sort of man playing a flute and a drum, so we're at a sort of medieval fair. and you go down, and they, you know, at the far end, if you want to eat historically, there are you know, past the Purbeck ice cream man and the venison sausage man. There's you know, there are 3 stalls selling historical food, so you can eat as Henry VIII did. And then there's classic military vehicles and farm equipment. I mean, there's just absolutely everything, and I love it to bits. And it lasts a week, and I wish it lasted 3 weeks.
Oh, same. It is absolute heaven for people like us, and I organise my whole year around it.
Well, I mean, don't we just? And I certainly do. So, you know, this beats anything else. I mean, as soon as the next year's dates are announced, then I block off the rest of the year. You know, it's the networking. It's just it's where fellow souls meet. And we have a lovely bookshop here with Waterstones, and so they not just have all your books, but they have every historical book that's been, you know, written and published in the last decade, stuff full of in their shop. I mean, they turn over more, I think, than any other Waterstones in this week in the United Kingdom. And you know, they've now been doing it for 15 years, and you know, so there is no other place to be if you have the remotest interest in history. And the best thing to do is come for the whole week rather than itty bitty choose this and that, because you never know who will turn up. And unfortunately this year, because the sodding election has been announced for the 4th of July, which was the launch date of my book on Winston Churchill. So all my political friends who are going to help me launch it are now unable to do that. And you know, the media spotlight will move away from humble book launches to election results. My book is trickling out here. But it just it then reminds us that you know, current affairs is just as much the story of our life, our country, of world history, because we're, you know, let's be honest, a Labour landslide is just around the corner, unless Mr. Starmer does something Sir Starmer does something very, very stupid. And that's exactly the same Labour landslide that happened in July 1945 that kicked Churchill out of office. So, you know, history comes back to bite us. It's always just around the corner, and you can't divorce it from current affairs. We have no knowledge of the future, so all we can do is reach back to the past to make sense of the present.
And that's a lovely quote to finish off on. Thank you very much, Peter, for coming on.
Thank you. Absolute delight. You know, can we have another hour, please?
Oh, I'd love to have another hour. We'll have to schedule one in for another time. That'd be brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay.